lectures, and I thank my hosts for having me here. I also thank all of you who continue to listen and to participate as you can. I know that we are all tired of being online and on Zoom and other platforms. It's an exhausting way to connect with one another. So I appreciate you spending more hours on uh, this somewhat wretched platform in order to stay connected in some way. It's a very specific kind of exhaustion, and I don't really understand it, but I think it's because we do depend on proximity to be regenerated, and the way we talk to one another now is precisely not through proximity. It's there's a bar on proximity, and it's hard to know what you think or feel. And I'm very grateful to those of you who have sent in questions on the chat. My remarks today will be somewhat briefer, I hope, and that gives me a chance to start to answer more of your questions or to ask you about your questions, if that's possible. I would also like to say that tomorrow I will make some remarks on queer and feminist appropriations of phenomenology and also criticisms of phenomenology. What are its limits? What are its naivetes? And perhaps help to explain why I might turn to this material to understand our pandemic world, um, and also to indicate where I think we need to go beyond it and in what direction. So, in the last two lectures, I have invoked some phenomenological writings to help me to think about aspects of the pandemic, but I did not mean to claim that phenomenology is the only framework useful to us, nor is it necessarily the best. I certainly don't seek to derive all my claims from that framework. I draw from it. It's true that I was formed in it. My dissertation advisor was a phenomenologist, and I took many courses in phenomenology. But in fact, I left it to write a dissertation on Hegel and then moved, as you probably know, into post-structuralism and an interest in Hannah Arendt and Levinas and others in my later life. But I'm returning, one might say, to an earlier time in my own thinking, or I found myself returning because so many of the elements brought forward by the pandemic seem to call in my mind for a return to phenomenology. I put some aspects of phenomenology into conversation with other theoretical commitments, including Marx, and as will become increasingly clear, feminist and queer theory. Husserl's own reflections on the epoche, or indeed on the practice of bracketing, came under criticism by both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. They insisted that one did not need a deliberate method to suspend our everyday assumptions about the world in order to make the world into a matter for phenomenological analysis. There were historical experiences in which the constituted structure of the world was suddenly called into question or exhibited. These are moments, we might say, of being exposed in one's naivete, perhaps humiliating, perhaps exhilarating. Writing 2 decades before Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, Max Scheler, a heterodox Husserlian, writing at the same time as Husserl, thought the tragic indicated that something of value has been destroyed, and that on the occasion of that destruction, some specific way that the world is constituted comes into visibility or comes into intelligibility. Destruction of this sort implies, or maybe indicts, the world in which such a destruction proves to be possible. It is as if such a possibility had lain outside the thinkable until a certain historical time, but once it became thinkable, it was directly apprehended as a possibility of the world itself. And as Denise Riley pointed out, it seems clear that Shaler is writing in the midst of war, and of course the forms of destruction associated with the First World War were surely unprecedented for that time. And many historians have written about the unprecedented character of that destruction. The world itself was not understood to contain or imply such a possibility before, so an event takes place that suddenly shows that the world itself had not been known, even though it was there as a defining and framing horizon of experience. It may be useful to remember that for Husserl in his Nachlass, and for Ludwig Landgräber, who elucidated his doctrine, and I quote, to form an idea of the world requires a systematic construction of the infinity of possible experiences. So there is a question of whether any concept of the world is unbounded by an infinity of possibilities that cannot be fully conceptualized or imagined within a limit. Whatever limit is imposed by the notion of a horizon has to be rethought, as well as the idea of infinity that, as it were, runs through the world and exceeds it. The history of influence and appropriation is surely complex, but both Merleau-Ponty and Sartre relied mainly on the French translations of Husserl, and they both borrowed from and contested his philosophical legacy. Sartre referred to the flesh briefly and in interesting ways, but most of his descriptions of the body tended to define it as an object among objects. Relying on a distinction between body and consciousness, he was subsequently called a Cartesian, and that was hardly a compliment, especially by those feminists who followed de Beauvoir. For de Beauvoir, the body was not an object, but rather a situation, and when she introduces that notion in the Second Sex, it is, interestingly, not Sartre she cites, but Merleau-Ponty. Indeed, the uses of Merleau-Ponty for feminism are extensive, if not vast, and I will turn to that more tomorrow in my last lecture as we consider the feminist and queer appropriations of phenomenology and its uses for understanding our pandemic present. For our purposes today, let me remind you that for Merleau-Ponty, as bodily beings, human creatures are in the world at the same time that the world is in us, its objects encrusted onto us. The body does not appear as an object among objects. Indeed, although Husserl wrote about the structures of intersubjectivity, Merleau-Ponty moved in another dimension, implying by his own language that philosophical understanding is better served by figures and appositions, and that the flesh would be a better way of understanding intersubjectivity. Indeed, the intersubjective dimensions of our lives, in his view, had to be understood as an interlacing, an overlapping, or perhaps through the rhetorical figure of the chiasm. The chiasm is that shared domain of two distinct entities which, in every other respect, are quite clearly unlike each other. What the body is, then, to some extent, is its relation to other bodies, and that relationality is to be thought as an ontological status that cannot be understood through the figure or concept of substance. It establishes and undoes the individual subject in the same stroke, where the individual subject is understood as a discrete body whose boundaries enclose rather than open. This here is my hand that touches something or someone, but that touch is always of something, which is either myself or another kind of being, which means that touching is intentional in the phenomenological sense. Touching is always a touching of something. The object orientation of touch, even when it is oneself that is touched, defines touching and even defines the hand. This formulation indicates both, I would call it the intentional, object-related, and worlded character of touch. This last has some consequences for thinking ethics and perhaps compels a rethinking of reciprocity, which has been so important for theories of ethical obligation and social equality alike. And I know that Fina Borales has asked me to think more about obligation, and I hope we can speak more about that in the conversation that follows. If we extend Merleau-Ponty's understanding of our lives as implicated in one another's at the level of the body and the senses, at the level of what he calls flesh, then what I do, my very action, is mine, yes, but also always defined in relation to something that is not myself, or myself as itself a kind of alterity for the more active version of this I. Within this framework, ethical conduct could not be described fully in the way that has been generally derived from Kant. I act according to a rule that everyone should adopt as the rule for their action. In that hypothetical scene, the other acts like me or should act like me if I am acting in the right way, and there is a parallelism between our actions and a form of reciprocity which assumes the duplication of action, yours and mine, according to the right rules. Or I am oriented by the same rules as you are, and our common orientation toward that set of rules makes possible ethical conduct based on reciprocity. I act toward you as I would have you act toward me, which means that the same action is undertaken, or the same kind of action, in accord with the same rule on both sides. The I and the you proliferate in such variations, but what is the presumed relation between the I and the you, the two sides, as it were, prior to their launch into the ethical scenario of deliberation? Can Kant give us direction here? Well, it may be that we have to refer to his aesthetics and think about the meaning of sensus communis in order to find an orientation here, but within the ethical writing, perhaps less so. And what if doing something to another is simultaneous with receiving the action of the other, such that doing and being done to are not exactly distinct? The one who touches is also touched, and also touches oneself, which means that there is an overlapping of my reflexive relation to myself and an intentional relation to another who also acts, even if not always in the same way or to the same degree. The two movements cross one another. Remember that by intentional, phenomenology does not mean deliberate or willful. It's actually deriving a doctrine and reworking a doctrine of intentionality from the medieval scholastics. And it carries the sense of being related to, oriented toward an object, that orientation is part of consciousness. It's an object-oriented structure of consciousness. For Merleau-Ponty, then, we cannot start with two distinct individuals, and neither can we easily subscribe to a strict distinction between activity and passivity. The reasons why have to do with how the body is implicated in the tangible and the tactile, the sensuous field, the visible, the oral, in which other bodies are implicated as well. These fields are not exactly third terms or spheres that mediate between humans, they are realms implied by the senses. They are intentionally, as it were, structured into the senses. This and that tactile creature cross each other in the realm of tactility, and the realm is implied by their actions. The relations are to be understood as chiasmic whenever we find each other touching the same surfaces and breathing proximate air. These domains of tactility or tangibility and respiration or breathability are both what we share and what we share differently, and also that which exceeds us and comprehends or embraces us at every instance of touch and breath. So, though they are part of what is common between us, perhaps also constitutive features of what we can call a common world, that does not mean that we share in them equally or that we are exposed to the same degree of toxicity or contagion that they relay. Merleau-Ponty sought to find a language that would challenge the epistemological exercise that presupposes the distance between subject and object. He called intentionality an embrace between the subject and its world. That was his way of redescribing the correlation between subjective structures of knowing and the countervailing field of the knowable. Consciousness and world are, in his view, suited for one another. Consciousness is equipped with structures to know the world as it is, and the world gives itself to consciousness to be known. This positing of a kind of adequacy between consciousness and world is, as I mentioned, a derivation of the medieval doctrine of intentionality, and it survives through the phenomenological legacy. I'm not fully convinced by this, by the way, but I appreciate the insistence on a harmonious brace between consciousness and world. It's a lovely thought, but what if it turns out to be more like a chokehold that deals pain rather than joy? What if consciousness and world are singularly ill-suited for one another? Anyway, we can talk about that. Merleau-Ponty's metaphors, however, are clearly erotic and harmonious. Even the interlacing does not seem like a bad deal. In my view, he underestimates the rage that can emerge from unstable forms of differentiation, although certainly he marked it in Humanism and Terror. For our purposes, I wish only to point out that the condition from which ethical questions and quandaries emerge is one in which we are acutely aware that we are not fully distinct from each other, nor fully the same, for we are already implicated in each other's lives prior to any contract or consent. Further, we may rail against that fact, the proximity to strangers, the interdependency on those we do not know or do not like, the inescapability of social relations themselves, perhaps because we are interdependent when it comes to matters of survival and living on, or because we share a world of air and surface, breathing and touching, that we are commonly obligated to find a way to regulate matters such as air pollution, viral transmission, bodily contact, employment injury, sexual violation. Such regulations come at a cost that some are not willing to pay. Those whose rights to destroy are bound up with their sense of personal freedom and even their right to profit. These are all issues with which we have to deal, not only because social and economic life is organized in specifically historical ways, and we have to struggle to exercise power to define those forms in the most just and equitable ways. At the same time, however, or rather, not just, but also because presupposed by that very social organization are domains or zones, fields without which embodied life cannot be thought, right? Including injurability, impressionability, passion, and susceptibility. In other words, we cannot um, uh, imagine away. Well, we can imagine it away, but we cannot regulate away our susceptibility, our impressionability, our impassioned responses, or indeed our injurability. Although we surely do object to ways that we are made socially vulnerable, and we insist that they cease to the degree that that's possible, that doesn't mean we can rule out vulnerability from our embodied life. And it surely does not mean that we idealize invulnerability as a norm to which we should all aspire. No. We can object to the kind of air we breathe and pass regulations to keep it healthy for ourselves and for all life forms that depend on it, as we must, but we cannot rule out the need for air to survive. Indeed, that requirement forms the basis of our claim. It's in fact, the first premise of our claim, even if we say that there are no primary needs that are not socially organized, and here I think of the important work of Agnes Heller on the social theory of needs. That does not imply that those needs are the simple effects of social organization. Those needs are the place where social organization interacts with the organism. This line of reasoning, I would suggest, the line of reasoning that thinks that needs, for instance, would be nothing other than the effects of social organization. That, I think, follows from a misunderstanding about what social construction is. What we call primary requirements or needs are always socially organized, yes, but not for that reason socially generated in full. And that is a distinction, to be socially organized and to be socially generated or made or engineered through social means. I mean, if that were the case, we could socially engineer ourselves to have no needs, and that is, well, it would be a cruelty against the organism, but it would also, I think, be an absolute impossibility. On the contrary, I would say that the need and requirement that we are talking about, eating, breathing, requiring shelter, all of which, by the way, are addressed in some extremely interesting ways by the early Marx, who has been, I think, too quickly dismissed for his humanism because of a possibly misguided Althusserian reading, is surely worth rereading now, and I hope to do that in the future and would encourage you to do it too. What I want to say here, bringing myself back from my polemic, the need and requirement, yes, need and requirement, life requirements, prompt social organization, and the two emerge together, but precisely because there are many ways to socially organize needs, we see the divergence between need and its social organization. Perhaps the word need is also unnecessary, although I think we should hold on to it, and that there's another way to designate primary requirements for life, conditions that must be met for the continuation or persistence of life. But the fact that we have to search for a word implies that something is there to be named. And again, my wager is that Marx's early manuscripts is one place to pursue this question. As I've tried to suggest, Merleau-Ponty leads us away from a subject-centered account of basic needs. He does not ask what a human subject requires, and he does not ask about human nature. Someone asked me a question about human nature. He does not ask what is the nature of the human. That is not his question. He's shifting the question for us. He notes the embodied modes by which the human engages with the world and how the various sensuous dimensions of the world take up the subject. Hence, it's not just the subject who is capable of touch or is tentacular in the ways described by Bruno Latour or Isabelle Stengers, although it would be useful to think about their views in relation to Merleau-Ponty. I believe there is a relationship there. For Merleau-Ponty, the tangible takes us up in its grip. The visible is a field which orchestrates my seeing in relation to being seen. This unwieldy and discontinuous, right, sequential reversibility shows itself again when my reflexivity overlaps with a relation to others and to objects and their relation to me. In other words, the field in which we act may appear as a third term that mediates between subject and other, but it functions rather as a way of disarticulating the subject-object dichotomy, even as it proves itself to compose them both. Indeed, the world may well prove to be such a term as well, and all these fields to which I have referred are maybe ways in which the world exhibits its possibilities in and through the senses and bodily experience, now redefined as an inextricable implication in the sensuous dimensions of others and the shared world. If we are, as it were, mired in each other, if our lives imply other lives that are equally dependent on domains of touch and breath, then when I ask, how shall I act, what to do in situations like the pandemic, how to conduct myself, I see that my doing is already bound up with yours, that I can hardly stand back to ask the question because I am already bound up with yours, which means that my doing is not mine alone. And though we are surely distinct, there is no question, there is no easy escape from this relation of mutual implication. So what would it mean to think ethically from the site of mutual implication? What would it mean to have that chiasm be the non-ground, the non-foundation, the slippery foundation of our ethical reflection? One reason for this interlacing, this interrelationship, is that we depend on and share the various fields of the tangible, the visible, the breathable, the edible, but also shelter, the inhabitable, and assistance or support of various kinds. Perhaps ethics is to some extent, maybe it depends on acknowledging these bonds and partially shared dependencies on these conditions of life and living, ones that exist prior to any deliberate actions that seek to establish, as if for the first time, a reciprocal relation between us, right? So the chiasm is not exactly reciprocity, right? The chiasm assumes that we are already interlaced. Reciprocity assumes we are distinct and that we must act toward one another as we would have the other act toward us, or in relation to the same rule. So there is it starts with the presumption of distinct subjects who are at a distance from one another. But with Merleau-Ponty, if we were to elaborate in ethics, it seems to me that the chiasm would be the point of departure. We are always already interlaced with one another. And what does it mean then to think from that place? It would not be a subject-centered ethics. It would acknowledge this interdependency. Now, I would also just interject that, as we know, that there's enormous resistance to this way of thinking, and that for many people, especially those who subscribe either implicitly or explicitly to modes of individualism, especially possessive individualism, the idea of a fundamental dependency of this sort and of a decentering of the subject through interdependency is enraging, right? It's insupportable. It is a dissolution of one's personhood. It is an attack on property. It is an attack on possession and distinctness and singularity. So this won't be easy to sell. Indeed, it's not a marketable good. It will never be a marketable good. And as I hope to show, it is anti-market. Okay, enough for my polemic. Odd to be laughing by myself in this room. Okay, so I am not sure that I know how to think ethics from this place of the chiasm, but I think it must be done. And I would say, however, despite my limitations, that the distinct I would no longer be the ground of such an ethic, since its very emergence as a discrete and foundational kind of category happens only through a denial of these other domains of interdependency, interlacing, and relationality. I started today by returning to Shaler briefly in order to pose the question, which value or set of values is destroyed in the world formation called tragic? I suppose that the pandemic has led me to Shaler in part because it is the destruction of the equal value of lives as an ideal that seems to be taking place, or is often at risk of happening in these times, and through several means, not just pandemic means. The destruction of value that takes place when lives are taken or destroyed or left to die under conditions of preventable death is the value of life, a value that only makes sense in light of the claim that all lives are equal or should be treated equally. Now, that may seem paradoxical, since the value of this or that life, as gleaned from memorials and memoirs, often relies on the singularity of that life and its value. For that reason, it seems to follow that some would fear that the assertion of equal value, the equal value of lives, would threaten the singular value of this or that life, would threaten it with the loss of its singularity, or indeed its value, presuming that value is to be found in singularity. And yet, when a number of people are killed by attacks, bombings, accidents, and illness, it would seem that public mourning is in order, and that the value lost is, as it were, one that is shared, or that somehow belongs to the people as a group, or indeed belongs to the world. It is a loss that the world suffers. We could say it is a loss that we suffer. It is also a loss that the world suffers, because those lives belong to the world, or should have belonged to the world, or indeed should have continued to belong to the world, and were prevented from belonging to the world by inadequate health care or brutal immigration policies. We can name some other, or bombings or attacks. It's surprisingly difficult to talk about the value of life or lives in this way, since value as a term has been so thoroughly co-opted by market and financial value. It's of course also hard to talk about the value of life when when right-wing religious sources have used that argument to oppose reproductive rights of women. I'm happy to address that, and we'll address that tomorrow. But it's hard to talk about the value of life outside of market and financial value. Some of the obituaries, for instance, that I find in the US papers, but also I read some papers in French and German as well, those people who have been lost in accidents, for instance, seem to rely on a concept of human capital, extolling the ways that someone appreciated their value as a person over time, that they accomplished certain things, that they conform to family norms, and that it's by virtue of these values that we mourn the loss of that person. We rarely see public obituaries extolling the value of someone who is homeless or who has lost their job or who was unable for various reasons to do much of anything at all, or who is gender nonconforming or lives outside of normative frameworks. If they are women, they're quickly ushered back into the domestic sphere. They are mourned because they raised children or they looked out for their neighbors. Is there another way to think about value when we talk about the destruction of values or what is valuable, right? Is there a way outside of market values? Is there a way outside of these normative conceptions of what the human is and what the social structures are, family, gender, race, that somehow support the ideality of the human? I think there is, but let us first confront market and financial values, as they themselves have become instruments of destruction. Yesterday, I talked briefly about the metric of value by which industries and universities proceed under pandemic conditions. And in that regard, there are silent, implicit, or vocalized and explicit calculations made about which deaths or how many deaths are acceptable for the market to reopen, for the university to reopen, for particular businesses to reopen. The question that is posed, implicitly or explicitly, is how many deaths constitute a reasonable price to pay for the revitalization of the markets, right? So life is drained from some humans so that life can be given to the market. This is, I guess, what I would call a cannibalizing of human life by the market, so that its life takes the place of human life. The value of the market and market values take the place of the value of human life. What are the values animated in such calculations, and what values are destroyed, right? Shaler's question, what values are destroyed? Giving rise to that exclamation with which I began, what kind of world is this? Giving rise also to the indictment of that world and the urgent call to animate or renew a different sense of world governed by another set of values. The question of reasonable death rates is usually posed by those who do not consider themselves a possible factor in the equation. They assume that their lives will be preserved. The one who calculates the acceptable level of death is not figured as a mortal creature. The act of calculation seems to lift that human creature out of the sphere of finitude, at least provisionally. The others, about whom the calculation is made, are those whose life and death can be calculated, but calculation seems to save the calculator from death, at least in the domain of fantasy. This post-sovereign, or perhaps neo-sovereign, form of calculation gives rise to a form of inequality that relies upon a metric of grievability, whose life, if lost, would count as a loss, even constitute an incalculable loss, and whose death can be quietly or vociferously calculated without ever naming it as such. Here is where social inequality works together with necropolitical violence. It would have laid out a clear path to resistance had the pandemic only etched firmly the contours of inequality within our institutions, households, and public spheres, exacerbating for many the lived peril, the lived sense of peril associated with the workplace, the home, where domestic violence is on the rise, and the street. And it would have marked out another path of political mobilization had the pandemic simply and clearly underscored the necessity of climate justice and rallied people across the globe to join in that impressive and urgent movement. But whatever politics we are now tasked with must put these two issues into conjunction, opposing both forms of destruction. Further, the communities of care that have emerged in the midst of this pandemic have constituted new social forms, life-giving, expanding the notion of shelter beyond the household, very important for women, for queer kids, for trans people, expanding the notion of shelter and sheltering beyond the borders of the nation, becoming trans-regional, if not global in character. And the same could be said about the public art now online that has us listening and watching in new ways. The police violence against Black people, brown people, the indigenous, women and men, trans people surely, travestis, and the indigenous in places like Brazil or the extraordinarily terrible conditions for the poor in India, these all coincide with the systematic forms of letting die promoted and accepted by market enthusiasts who operate under the guise of realism. Now, some would say, well, what we need is a renewed humanitarianism, and I'm quite sure that humanitarianism serves its purpose, and I don't accept the argument that it can be reducible to its darker sides. And yet, while I understand the humanitarian effort to identify vulnerable groups in order to provide assistance and service to vulnerable groups, I have some questions about how that works. It's right to provide assistance to those who are especially likely to suffer the virus as a ravaging and life-threatening disease, and to contrast them with those who are not at risk of losing their lives through the pathogen, although how do we know, how do we ever know who will and will not lose their lives? It may be that someone has a pre-existing condition they do not know about until the virus brings it out. Of course, the vulnerable, yes, include, at least in the US, Black and brown communities deprived of adequate health care throughout their lifetimes, and the history of this nation, the poor, the migrant, the incarcerated, the disabled, trans and queer people who struggle to achieve rights to health care or who don't like going to health care because they will be treated as the wrong gender or pathologized or discriminated against in other ways, and all those with prior illnesses and enduring medical conditions. The pandemic exposes the heightened vulnerability to the illness of all those for whom healthcare is neither accessible nor affordable. But perhaps, even though we identify vulnerable groups, I worry that that puts vulnerability over there with that groups and then designates everyone else who's not in that group as invulnerable, which cannot be true, which is why I'm suggesting that rather than divide us into groups like that, we understand vulnerability as part of the interrelationality that binds us as humans. In other words, what can happen to the other can happen to me, and much of it depends on how we conduct ourselves in relationship to our shared world and our interlaced existences. Yes, the pandemic exposes the heightened vulnerability to the illness for all of those, on the part of all of those for whom healthcare is neither accessible nor affordable. But let us not forget that there are perhaps two lessons about vulnerability that follow. It describes a shared condition of social life, of interdependency, exposure, and porosity. It also names the greater likelihood of dying, understood as the fatal consequence of a pervasive social inequality. So there are two levels. On the one hand, it is a shared condition of life, and we deny that at our peril, because that distributes vulnerability to some and not to others, and that cannot be true. At the same time, we must oppose those social conditions that deny our commonality and seek to establish vulnerability as the property of some groups rather than others. That's the unequal distribution of vulnerability, an effort to try to engineer its unequal distribution. And that denies the commonality and is wrong for doing so. That's why we oppose the social inequality. In my recent book, The Force of Nonviolence, I argue that the difference between the grievable life and the ungrievable life can be understood as a form of inequality, but also the effect, if not the expression, of violence. So to explain what I mean by that, let me start with the question, what does it mean to be grievable? Well, we may think that someone or something lost is grievable or ungrievable to the extent that it's either publicly marked and acknowledged, or it passes without acknowledgement and with no trace. I draw on Freud's argument in Mourning and Melancholia, in which he argues that mourning consists of an acknowledgement of loss, an acknowledgement of the reality of loss. Indeed, that reality of loss must be registered, and that registering, it's a kind of somatic registration, usually happens bit by bit. One goes through life and notes again and again that something is lost, that someone is lost who used to be there in this or that situation. And so the verdict of loss comes from reality, and it comes in bits and pieces over time. The verdict of reality is delivered over time as the not there-ness of the person, right? And that is marked, that is known, that is registered or acknowledged. But of course, the loss may be of a person, or it might be of a group, or it might even be of an ideal, which I will talk about in a moment. Melancholia, on the other hand, is often described as the failure to acknowledge that a loss has happened, the refusal to acknowledge that a loss has happened. And sometimes it's understood to be a kind of conscious denial or a semi-conscious denial. And other times it can be exceedingly unconscious, a refusal to register, a keeping the content out so that there is no somatic registration of the loss. The difference between mourning and melancholia seems to turn then on this question of acknowledgement. Since Gender Trouble, more than 30 years ago, I have sought to extend the analysis of mourning and melancholia from the individual psyche to broader cultural issues. And many people, of course, have done this. Anne Chang and David Eng and David Kazanjian, and well, we could name many, many people who have sought to extend Freud's analysis to genocide, to other forms of cultural melancholia in which massive losses are denied, or where there is a failure to acknowledge massive losses. Under conditions where one's love or attachment cannot be acknowledged, let's say there's a prohibition on acknowledgement, and one loses what one loves, one can neither, within that public space, acknowledge that love, nor acknowledge that loss. And of course, that leaves a person in a melancholic condition, one that could be understood as culturally induced through a set of prohibitions on acknowledgement. And a melancholic condition is one that includes, I guess, what we would call elements of depression and mania. Of course, to understand mourning and melancholia, it matters what one loses, what one has lost. It can be a person or the love of a person, but Freud at least is clear that it can be an ideal of the nation, and it can even be an ideal of race. For instance, white supremacists are undergoing a form of the manic form of melancholia as we speak, because they have lost their supremacy and they refuse to acknowledge that loss. Okay. I suggested, for instance, early in my career that gender itself may be constructed through melancholia to the extent that some versions of cis masculinity, not all, depend upon the denial of a man for any feelings of love for other men, right? According to these men, they never loved a man. They could never love a man, and they've never lost a man. Now, a double denial produces certain melancholic formations, and interestingly, it is shared among those who dwell in that version of masculinity. Did you ever love a man? No, I never loved a man. Did you love a man? No, all those people who love men, desire men, they're over there. We are over here. We, in fact, have a bond in our denial of ever having loved a man. Now, the problem is that boys who love boys seems to be very common among young people, and yet a certain kind of construction of masculinity over time also includes an instruction on how best to deny the fact that there may well have been feelings of that kind. The claim that, well, that some people make, a kind of rigid heterosexuality, I would never be gay and never have been gay, that kind of double negation forecloses a loss. It may also deny any feelings of that sort, thus not acknowledging what might be a relatively common desire and certainly refusing the loss of that desire that normative gender requires. I mean, it's possible to say, well, I guess I could have had some of those feelings, or I did have them, but I actually really like being straight. And, I congratulate you. That's beautiful if you like being straight. The problem here is simply what happens when it is foreclosed as thinkable? It is not thinkable. And how does that foreclosure of gayness or a non-conforming masculinity even that foreclosure become a kind of basis, a defensive basis for identity itself? One question I asked years ago was whether gender melancholia of this sort has a certain cultural generality, whether we can speak of a cultural melancholia, one that is commonly found among straight men whose masculinity depends more or less on a steadfast denial of the mere thought of their possible gay desires. I was in part guided by a study authored by the Mitscherlichs, The Inability to Mourn, which appeared in the 1950s, documenting, I believe it's the 1950s, a pervasive melancholia in German culture during the post-war years. It appeared that the Germans who were interviewed by the Mitscherlichs could not acknowledge or mourn their own losses or indeed their own destructiveness, and yet they were haunted by experiences of destruction and loss that they could not quite name and hence could not quite mourn. Remember, acknowledgement is the precondition of mourning. It is what distinguishes mourning from melancholia. The rush to move beyond the Nazi years into the economic boom of the 1950s brought with it, I think, a mania for the market and a pervasive sense of depression at the same time. In recent years, I've tried to think about wars and public attacks on human life and asked the question whose life is a candidate for public mourning and whose is not. It struck me as significant that the US never mourns those they kill, but only its own citizens. And among its citizens, it mourns only those who tend to be white and propertied and married. It does that, at least, more easily than it mourns those who are poor, queer, black, brown, indigenous. More recently, and here again today, this morning or this evening, as the case may be, I want to suggest that living humans carry a sense of whether or not they belong to the grievable classes, as it were. So grievability and ungrievability do not just pertain to those who have been lost. They also pertain to those who are alive, but who feel themselves to be in principle ungrievable. So the question is, what is it to be alive and to sense that one's life is not grievable, that it would not be acknowledged if it were lost. It would not be marked as a loss worth marking. To say of a living person that they are grievable is to say that they would be grieved were they to be lost. It is also to say that the world is organized in such a way that it seeks to sustain that life, to support the future and persistence of that life. And those who live with the sense that there is no certainty about food or shelter or health care also live with a sense of their dispensability. I could disappear and it would not be marked. The public world, the political world, the government, the social world that is tasked with my care or should be tasked has deemed me to be dispensable. Part of living with that sense of dispensability I am suggesting is simply the sense that one could die and pass from the earth, and that would leave no mark and there would be no acknowledgement. It's a sense that one's own life does not matter to others, or rather that the world is organized, the economy in particular is organized, so that the lives of some will be safeguarded and the lives of others will not. When, for instance, we see how the economy starts up, knowing full well that some people will die as a result, a class of dispensable people is being designated. They are not receiving an explicit death sentence, but they are receiving an implicit death sentence. This is, I would suggest, also a fascist moment that emerges in the midst of a market calculation. And we are living in a time when this form of calculation threatens to become the norm. It is, in fact, a rationality and a power that we must fight. So to live as someone with a sense of being ungrievable is to understand that one belongs to the class of the dispensable, to feel that abandonment as basic institutions of care are withdrawn or fail to arrive at crucial moments and times. This is, I want to suggest, a melancholia that belongs to the sense of foreclosed futurity. And it is what many people experience, those with unpayable debts, those with absent health care, those with sporadic housing and income. If this life is not regarded as worthy of safeguarding, then is this a life without value? And what sense of value is accorded to lives? To what metric does it belong? I've argued that in order to understand social inequality, we have to understand how grievability is unequally distributed. That unequal distribution is a key component of social inequality, and we fail to grasp social inequality if we do not reference grievability as one of its component parts. Second, the designation, whether explicit or not, of a group or population, or indeed a class, as ungrievable means that they can be targeted or left to die without consequence. Hence, the kind of social inequality established by differential grievability is also a form of death dealing, a form of violence. In my view, the struggle for a nonviolent politics is at once a struggle for the equal value of lives and against the lethal logics, the necropolitical metrics that continue to designate parts of the population as dispensable, lives not worth safeguarding, lives not worth mourning. Thus, the two parts of my argument imply that the struggle against social inequality has to be a struggle also against differential grievability, and that this struggle is part of a nonviolent politics. For nonviolence is not only opposing this or that act of violence, although it is, but violent institutions and policies, violent states that adopt as their policy, the targeting of populations for death, or letting people die in conditions of duress without seeking to prevent it. We can think here surely about the European Union's cruel and criminal policy toward migrants in the name of the law, right? Criminality in the name of the law, and its hideous criminalization of humanitarian actors who seek the criminalization of justice, who seek to preserve the lives of those seeking to cross the Mediterranean when nation states refuse to help them. Under conditions of pandemic, it may be that we are all suffering from versions of melancholia. How does it become possible to mourn so many people? What kind of public mark or monument would begin to address this need to mourn? Where gatherings are themselves highly restricted, and gatherings are for many a way to mourn, what ways are left? Perhaps you have also attended the Zoom memorials and know the difficulty of this practice. The inability to see someone close before they go, the inability to gather with those who know that person. These make for truncated experiences of loss, where acknowledgement is difficult to accomplish. It cannot happen openly and together with others. Many are, in fact, returned to the household as the site for mourning, deprived of the public gathering in which such losses are marked, registered, shared. The internet has more fully claimed its status as the new public sphere, but it can never fully substitute for the gatherings, both private and public, that allow losses to be fathomed and lived through with others. A purely private form of mourning is possible, but cannot assuage the open cry, the need for stories, the songs that petition the world to bear witness to this loss. And with public losses of this magnitude and quick succession, there are political questions that are linked with the demand for public mourning. To say that all these lost lives are grievable means that they are lives worthy of acknowledgement, equal in value to every other life, a value that cannot be calculated. The images of bodies piled high in Ecuador or stacked in closets in New Jersey or northern Italy let us know that the infrastructure of hospitals has been overwhelmed and underfunded, and the conditions were not in place to respect the dead. Too often, though, the images flit by as sensational clips on this internet. Sequestering enforces both a sense of ambient death and a shared practice of deflection. Let's not focus on the negative. Learning to mourn mass death means marking the loss of someone whose name you do not know, whose language you may not speak, who lives at an unbridgeable distance from where you live. I would suggest one does not have to know the person in their singularity to affirm that this was a life. The right to belong to the world is an anonymous right, but no less obligatory for that reason. What one often grieves, I think, is the life cut short, the life that should have had a chance to live more, the value that person has carried now in the lives of others, the wound that permanently transforms those who live on. What someone else suffers is not one's own suffering, but that hardly makes it unthinkable. The loss that the stranger endures echoes with the personal loss one feels, even though it is not the same. Strangers in grief nevertheless form a kind of collectivity. The modes of market calculation and speculation that have accepted death for many as the price to pay for supporting the health of the market are tacitly deciding which groups, the vulnerable groups, may die, and they are accepting the sacrifice of life as a reasonable price, a reasonable norm. And it does qualify as reasonable within that particular rationality. The question is whether that particular rationality is reasonable, which it is not. That market rationality is not all of rationality. It's not the only rationality. Indeed, that rationality of calculation meets its limit, or should meet its limit, precisely when we, following Derrida, assert the incalculable value of lives. Interestingly, it was in Derrida's reading of Husserl's Crisis of the European Sciences that he starts to derive the incalculable value of life through recourse to Kant, in seeking to understand, and I quote, the possibility of an incalculable that is neither irrational nor dubitable. Derrida notes that, and I quote again, a rational and rigorous incalculability presented itself as such in the greatest tradition of rationalist idealism. The rationality of the rational has never been limited, as some have tried to make us believe, to calculability, to reason as calculation, as ratio, as account, an account to be settled or an account to be given. We will later draw, he remarks, on some of the consequences of this, and indeed he wrote about this at great length, especially in his work on the death penalty. The role that dignity, Würde, for example, plays in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals belongs to the order of the incalculable. In the kingdom of ends, it is supposed to it is opposed to what has a price on the market, Marktpreis, and so can give rise to calculable equivalences. The dignity of a reasonable being, the human person, for example, and this for Kant is the only example, is incalculable as an end in itself. So one question I have, and it is indeed an open one, is how we could understand the incalculability of the value of lives in the plural, that accept the singularity of life, but actually find the value precisely in world belonging, in the interlacing among distinct creatures who have equal right to belong to the world. Indeed, I wish that Kant had invoked this argument when he supported the death penalty, arguing that our lives belong to the state, but we can change it so that we move in a more Arendtian direction. We belong to the world, or we should. Remember that Arendt told us that Eichmann had no right to decide with whom he could cohabit the earth. Humans lack any such right. They do not have that freedom, for they are born into a cohabitation, we might call it a persistent diversity, that is a condition of life itself, a condition of common life, what it means to belong to both earth and world. We may not love the connections, the social interrelations into which we are born. Very few of us actually get to choose the families we are born into, if we are born into families. But the obligations of cohabitation are not born from love. The relations between us are who we are, and this constitutes a sociality that goes beyond community, nation, and territory. It takes us, in fact, in the direction of the world. I have suggested, and this is my final remark, I have suggested that interdependency describes a condition of life awkwardly and necessarily shared, the perils and passions of bodily exposure, of porosity, taking or letting something in, letting something out, existing, as it were, in that threshold and through such passages. When social inequality implies a greater likelihood of dying, then the portal to the future is a more radical and substantive social equality, a more mindful form of collective freedom, and a mass mobilization against violence in its explicit and fugitive forms. If we seek to repair the world, or indeed the planet, then the world must be unshackled from the market economy that traffics and profits from its distribution of life and death. A politics of life would not be the reactionary one, nor would it be a simple vitalism. It would be rather a reflection, or it would at least be based in a reflection, on the shared conditions of life for the purposes of realizing a more radical equality and honoring a nonviolent mandate, and rethinking freedom beyond possessive individualism. Perhaps this is a way to begin again the world, even as that world is already underway, to repair forward, as it were, as a new imaginary emerges from the hauntings of the present. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Judith. Splendid. Questions, remarks, first from commentators.
Who would you like first, Judith?
Yeah, please, Howard. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Judith. I'm quite overwhelmed by it. I have many thoughts kind of generated by what you said. I mean, if I just say them, I mean, maybe or say the thoughts that occurred to me in a random way, maybe they'll make kind of more sense to you than they're really doing to me. Kind of the first kind of thought I had, or question I had, and this has been kind of emerging over the lectures, is, I think I begin to get why you are kind of laying such value on value, kind of why kind of value is kind of important in the way that that you're thinking. But I wondered kind of whether, especially towards the end, kind of this evening, whether you weren't kind of pointing us beyond value. So it's not that you were saying interlacing or interdependence is an alternative value to market valuations. So we're not revaluating market values, but in a sense, you're inviting us to think outside of value altogether. That's something, that there's a sphere of thought. And I felt this felt more kind of persuasive when you were discussing non-violence than when you were thinking of a new equality, because equality seemed to introduce a calculation or a value kind of once more. That was kind of one line of questioning that was occurring to me, and another one was, and again, this was kind of prompted, or you incited this when you mentioned your earlier work. It was very interesting, particularly in the middle parts of your lecture today. That registration came back. I was happy to see, and acknowledgement. But what I didn't hear was kind of recognition, and I was kind of wondering whether you feel that, is there any value in kind of returning to, or do you see any value in returning to a Hegelian phenomenology, kind of now, going back to, thinking of the interlacing as the spiritual daylight of the present, the I that is a we, the we that is an I, and kind of then looking at the pathologies that kind of Hegel kind of shows us kind of at work. Maybe I could see a virtue in that it would kind of show us the violence and exclusion. And Hegel thematizes that more in a way than perhaps Merleau-Ponty kind of would with interlacing and the chiasm. And kind of the third, and I know we're both kind of very we both love reading Kafka very much. I was just struck by how your descriptions of the condition of ungrievability just seem to kind of describe kind of Kafka's America, or the lost one. There's just so many examples. Almost everybody in that novel is living an ungrievable life. And I wondered, and then this was the thought I was trying to kind of put together. I mean, I was always struck by how Kafka's work as a workers' insurance official was basically, his work was to calculate the value of life, and he was very kind of struck, by kind of how certain industries had the same number of deaths every year. particularly, and he began to develop the thought, and I think this occurs in his novels as well, that actually, this is not a matter of letting die. This is a matter of killing. That the market just doesn't let people die, or doesn't say, well, some the calculations kind of in the UK around kind of COVID are usually in terms of hundreds of thousands, but it's not that they can be we can allow those to die, but they must be killed. And this, I think, Kafka kind of says, this is what's happening in America. That kind of Carl Rossman becomes one of those who must be killed. There's a little story within the novel where a young woman describes the death of her mother, and her mother, kind of, you can see, is she dies in an industrial accident. She falls from a building site, but she, Kafka's making clear, she was one who had to die. She was killed by American capitalism. She wasn't. She wasn't left to die. So, I mean, those are the thoughts that that were generated today. I mean, do they make any sense to you as a whole? Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I was, when I was originally asked to give these lectures, I thought I would, in fact, give lectures on Kafka, and then changed my mind, thinking that I needed perhaps to address the present moment in a different way,
Yeah.
and found myself writing bits and pieces on the pandemic, which I thought would be useful to put together. But of course, you point out to me that they are they do relate to one another in some ways that are, I think, you've made clear, and I very much appreciate your comments. Well, I do think value is important outside of market value, and but I think perhaps that when we talk about a new equality, we're not talking about an equality between this individual and this individual, even though most progressive law does exactly that. Although sometimes it's about class action suits, and then we have groups that have been excluded, and we can show that members of those groups are not being treated in the same way as other people have been treated. So, but I think that many of our ideas of equality are still based on a form of individualism, such that we compare individuals, or we want to establish equivalences among individuals. And once we have a radical equivalence, then we have radical equality. But I think it would be very interesting to rethink equality in terms of something like I don't know if I would call it a right, but I want to maybe stay with that for a moment, like an equal right to belong to the world that emerges precisely from a condition of interdependency, such that we belong to each other and belong to the world, and that from that kind of vexed belonging, that interlacing, we derive a principle of equality. And so for those who have been left to die, they have been disenfranchised. But it's not a question of so much comparing individuals as it is looking at policies, and especially state and non-state policies, state and market policies that actually produce classes of the dispensable and the indispensable. So what would happen if we took the problem of equality differently and asked how and in what way are certain populations for certain purposes being designated as the dispensable? That's both inequality and death dealing at the same time. And I want to kind of think of it more as a form of power, perhaps, that is, or maybe as a problem. I'm tempted, and I have said, a new way of thinking distributive justice, right? We haven't talked, I don't see Nancy Fraser talking about the distribution of grievability, but it would be great if she did, right? We talk about the distribution of goods, we talk about the unequal distribution of resources, but we don't talk about the unequal distribution of life itself, or of grievability, or of dispense. What would it mean? Um, I mean, obviously, the point would not be to make everybody equally dispensable, right? That would be a perversion of the whole aim. But it does seem to me that there's a kind of a norm that we might say, which is not about the equal value of every life so much. I mean, maybe taking it away from that part of Kant, but understanding but beginning with a conception of our sociality, and what it is to be an interlaced, globally speaking, an interlaced sociality with equal rights to belong and persist in the world. And I don't have it worked out, but that is just a gestural way of pointing to what I would like to see. And I don't believe that, I mean, it might involve calculation to the degree that we have a critique of how deaths are being calculated. And we may need to exhibit that calculation, but the critique would itself not be a calculation, at least as far as I can tell. Of course, one of the great limits of Merleau-Ponty is that he makes the world too beautiful, and he makes, relationships too harmonious, and it's a great love song. What can I say? And I totally agree that that Hegel opens up the question of violence, and in particular, Hegel taken with Freud, we actually start to see how the rage against dependency, the rage against interdependency, thinking about the lordship and bondage struggle. It is occasioned precisely by the scandal that there is somebody over there who is like me, or who claims to be a self like I am a self. It's like unbearable. I'm the only self, this person must be annihilated. And then the depressive recognition, like, oh, if I kill the other person kills me. We have to find a way to live together. It does give us the violence and rage that goes with having to cohabit. And that, we don't see well in someone like Merleau-Ponty. We will never derive that from Merleau-Ponty. Maybe through an oblique reading of Humanism and Terror, but I don't think we can turn to him for that. And then, yes, I mean, acknowledgement and recognition are linked in Hegel. I mean, and I do believe that there's something important about Hegel's concept of recognition, which is that the acknowledgement of loss also, the acknowledgement, if we read Anerkennung as acknowledgement, as some English translations do, I think recognition does not just happen between two pre-existing people. The act of recognition also transforms them each. So there is a transformative power of recognition. And in the same way, the recognition of loss for Freud also involves the transformation of the one who has endured or is enduring loss. One agrees to or consents to a transformation by acknowledging a loss. One becomes another kind of creature than one was prior to the loss. And that is a very important dimension of Hegel that I continue to work with, certainly in other settings. As for Kafka, I think it's generally underappreciated that he was dealing all the time with adjudicating industrial accidents. And he found it unbearable. I mean, his training as a lawyer made him qualified to do so, but he also left that job at a certain point because I think he couldn't really bear it. And one thing I would say is that, some of Kafka's, I mean, you mentioned The Lost One in Kafka's America, but some of his creatures that have lost human form, like Odradek or the panther in the synagogue, they seem to have human characteristics, but they're not finite. They don't die. And one reason I think they don't die, why they continue to last for generations and generations, is that they're never acknowledged. They're deprived of an acknowledgement as a human or even as an animal of a certain kind. And the deprivation of acknowledgement allows them to live on in this sort of crazy way. Like only humans die. Only the generations of humans pass from one to another because those are generations. They have finitude. And then these creatures who are outside of generational logics, who don't belong to families, who have lost their human form because they're such alienated creatures, they actually don't die. They just live on in a kind of indefinite time. And they even become figures of eternity in an odd way, which is why, Adorno thought maybe these odd creatures were the moments of hope in Kafka.
Oh, thank you, Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was, very touching listening to you. And I feel a little bit like Howard. There is a kind of constellation of reactions that I would like to share as briefly as I can. The general feeling that I had listening to you is that, and you correct me if this is the wrong impression, is that as if you as if you were moving from a politics of affects in your precarious life, 2004, to a politics of life, like you stated at the end of your lecture, no? So it's like in this, almost 20 years, there's been this move. I am not saying that affect is lost. I'm just saying that you are moving to this other aspect of it. And I'm not saying either that you are moving from a politics of loss to a politics or negative politics, as it were, or politics of negativity to a politics of affirmation. But maybe it could be said that there is a displacement from this politic of affect, where loss is the main problem, the main political knot, the main political tool, even, to a politics of life where value has taken this place, the place that loss had in this politic of affects. Yet there are there's I can see like a common thread in something is still there in this, despite this move, despite this displacement. And namely what I see, I remember that when in Precarious Life you spoke about the enigmatic potential of mourning. You spoke about the unpredictable effects of loss. This, of course, brings us back to the tragic elaboration of Schiller, no? But it also brings it forward to what you just stated now, what you elaborated on today, namely this incalculability of politics, this element that you, if I understand you correctly, we need to insufflate in our political life, in our the political dimension of our life and of our worlds, in order to take into account life and the value of life. I see that what you said, I mean, what you said about the effect of loss, that you said that loss cannot be measured, it cannot be planned, this is still left in your consideration, in this politics of life, in this consideration of value, precisely value away from the framework of the market, right? I don't know if I'm totally wrong, getting it completely wrong. If I am, please help me clarify it. And then there is another thing I wanted to comment on, which has to do with this incalculability. And when Merleau-Ponty, it is true that there is this kind of harmonic way of depicting the world, and this entrelac mode of relation. But if I remember correctly, in the phenomenology of the senses, Merleau-Ponty has this chapter on the body, and he speaks about this sexed body with Freud. And there, even though it is true, you're right, I agree with you that you might maybe not derive a conflictive understanding of relationships from that point, but I think that Merleau-Ponty nevertheless is aware of that kind of reportless report that I said yesterday, no, this kind of non-coincidence in relations. And when he speaks about Freud's consideration of symptoms, I mean, symptom is possible because of the different meanings very same experience might have for one individual, for one subject, no? And this difference of meanings relies on the unconscious, precisely, no? This is the element I was going there because I wonder how, to what extent this element of unconsciousness is also speaks also of this incalculability. For instance, when you spoke about melancholia, and this is the third thing I want to mention, and that's my last remark. Do you take that element of incalculability in your account of melancholia? When you speak of cultural melancholia, so it seems to me as if this element is not really taken into account, as if the foreclosure that you speak about, for instance, of men not wanting to have anything to do with their gayness or their desire for other men, as if this was a completely conscious decision. I don't want to have anything to do about this. And this I wonder how do you account for this unconscious element in melancholia that is crucial for Freud, no? That's it. Thank you very much. And forgive the chaos.
No, there's no chaos. We're all thinking something through together, and it's great. Thank you so much. I would say, first of all, that I don't know. Maybe it's true that I've moved from affect to value, but I think value actually has to do with loss, with the question of grievability. And I guess even though I don't usually like rehearse my work in this way, I thought it might be helpful to understand why the notion of grievability has become important, especially in contemporary politics, where it's very clear that certain populations are not being actively grieved, or that they are passing without much of a mark, and certainly without a sufficient mark, and they ought not to be passing. They ought not to be passing away when their deaths are clearly preventable. and there is a lack of responsibility on the part of states and interstate institutions, international institutions, and local ones, to prevent those deaths. So I am, I suppose, concerned about that. Although I was also, back in gender trouble, when HIV and AIDS were happening, and we were struggling to achieve the right to mourn publicly, it was an enormous struggle. There was so much shame at the beginning, at least in the US, and I know in certain parts of the world that shame still exists, and in certain parts of the US it still exists, right? It's not a progressive history, but there was so much shame attached with contracting that disease, and we had to fight that shame in order to publicly acknowledge, mark, mourn those who died, and in order to make the case to Dr. Fauci, who's back, that they needed more to put more funding into research. So those acts of public mourning were also acts of protest against government failure to produce educational programs and research funding that would save those lives. And so everything, not almost everything, starts there for me. And the parade follows, and the protest follows, and the gathering follows, and the assembly follows. So I don't know if I've changed. I think that I've been opposing unnecessary death for some time, and I've been militating for public acknowledgement for some time. And maybe that's the way to see the continuities. I don't know. But I will think about whether there's a displacement from affect. It could be. They could be. But also, you're absolutely right to say again that Merleau-Ponty emphasizes this non-coincidence, kind of comic, tragic non-coincidence, right? One imagines one's in some sort of encounter together, and yet the moments of exchange are always, at a certain remove. There's this dehiscence, I think he uses that word, between the moments of encounter, which produce it's an interval, right, which makes it non-simultaneous, and there is something to be said about that. I don't think that quite accounts for conflict or rage or even, destruction. I think, and I hope I made this explicit, I don't think melancholia is the result of a conscious decision, but I sometimes put in propositional form, following Freud, because he used to do this. He would say the unconscious works according to this proposition, and then he would say what the unconscious is saying. So it sounds like it's a deliberate speaker, but it's not. But I sometimes give propositional form to unconscious process just to dramatize it. Maybe it's a pedagogical technique that I've acquired over time. So when I say, as a man, I've never loved another man, I never lost another man, this is not my problem. I mean, I'm acting out a certain personality, but actually I think they're really very unconscious processes. But I also think that forms of cultural power and prohibition are also operating at an unconscious level, and that we have to think about melancholia as part of the psychic life of power, right? Which is why I lodged that analysis in that book, to show that it's not just a psyche or an unconscious working in its autonomous way, even though there might be processes that are very distinctively psychic. The psyche is saturated by sociality. And for the person who asked me whether I follow Lacan, I do not. I mean, I read Lacan, he's totally interesting, and I think he's brilliant. Don't get me wrong, and I teach him, and my students work on him, and some of my best friends are looking, but look, I love, Freud is where I continue to live, and the queer Freud has been very important to me. But also precisely because I don't accept that the social is can be adequately described by the symbolic, and I don't see it as completely. I don't see the social as separate from the psychic. That's a fundamental disagreement that I have, and there are more as well for another time. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk and reflections. I just want to comment something about Arendt and asking you on responsibility in this context of thinking that we are interrelated prior to any autonomous initiative. No, we are, before we act, we are interrelated one to another. In this sense, the question is of what are we responsible for, and in this context, it means that we are not responsible for what we have done, but for an enormous responsibility for the world, no? For the world, or for, I think it was Agnes Heller who spoke about enormous responsibility when we think about the subject, not the modern subject, then responsibility gets enormous. It's just asking you about what do you think about that. And the other thing is, it has me interested a lot, your last question about how to understand the incalculability of life in plural, because I think here Arendt asks something similar in a text. I think it was speaking about Jaspers, but perhaps I am wrong, I don't remember. But I have the text in English, and she says that it is quite conceivable that one fine day, a highly organized humanity will conclude quite democratically, namely by majority decision, that for humanity as a whole, it would be better to liquidate certain part thereof, certain part of humanity. She says it's quite thinkable that this can happen. And she says the question is not trying to think like moderns with normative criterion of rights. It is not a question of utility, but the question stands. No? I think it is difficult to think here, and I think this is a very important question in the moment when in our time, and at the same time, if we think starting from the world, no world. And you have said a lot of things about cohabitation, for example, between Israel and Palestine. We don't need to be friends. We need to have to find a way to for cohabitation. And this, I think it is very interesting and very difficult. And I don't know if values, thinking in values helps. No? I am not sure. First, perhaps is Shella, who thinks in values, who he has introduced. It is just, this text of Arendt is very similar in questioning this. She has no answer. Perhaps the answer is on the end of the Eichmann in Jerusalem, but no? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fina, and thank you for speaking English with me. It's always great to be in conversation with you, and it's been very important for me to learn from you over these years, and it's great to see you, even though it's a crazy platform. Okay. I think one reason I'm trying to think value, and I haven't thought very much about value. I think Shaler got me doing this in the last weeks in preparing for these. There are two reasons, I guess. Can we think value in a new way, which is not market value? Or can we think it in light of cohabitation? What would it mean to use even the Arendtian framework of cohabitation? Set aside Merleau-Ponty for the moment, but let's just using that. What would it look like? What is the value of life in that context? And so that's one question I have. I don't have an answer for it. But also in the Black Lives Matter movement, Cornel West is constantly, when asked to explain Black Lives Matter, and there are several explanations, and there are very interesting debates on how to think about that claim and that movement. Says the equal value of lives, the equal value of lives, but also because he's a socialist and someone who is very influenced by John Dewey and by pragmatic Hegelians. He's also clear that that the lives that we're talking about, however distinct they may be, are also bound together, and that binding is part of a fabric of obligation that we have. We are at both interdependent and obligated, and that they go together. Why they go together, how to explain that is of course another issue. I think that when Arendt claimed that Eichmann thought he could choose with whom to cohabit the world, he was invoking a freedom that he does not have and cannot have. It was a false notion of freedom, and it was a lethal, genocidal notion of freedom. So she was actively saying, you don't have that freedom. She didn't say you don't have that right, but you are not free to choose. There's a dimension of cohabitation that we do not choose, that is unchosen, that is unwilled, and that it must remain that way. Like, do not touch this with your freedom. Do not think you can rearrange this. Proximity, cohabitation, it is unwilled and must remain unwilled. And we affirm the unwilled, unchosen character of proximity and cohabitation. It is, it is what she says is given to us, right? It's cohabiting the earth, and that seems right. I think we have to ask whether there's an ecological reading of cohabitation and inhabitation that we could also add to that. But it is, I would suggest, the basis of her argument against genocide. Now, of course, we have certain clear examples of genocide. We have the genocide against the indigenous people of North America and South America. We have the genocide against the Armenians. We have genocide, the Nazi genocide against the Jews and the Roma and the communists and the disabled and we can go on and list genocides that we have known historically. But the argument against genocide also has to be made, I think, against the genocidal trajectory of the market, right? What I'm calling the death drive of the capitalist machine, right? That is a different way of accomplishing death. That is a different way of targeting populations, but it's wrong for the same reason that genocide is wrong. It's a different historical configuration. What's happening with migrant communities and what's happening with letting die at the border, in detention camps where people are stateless and rightless. This is also, I would say, part of what we mean by genocide when a certain population is targeted. So the anti-genocidal politics has to change form depending on the form that genocide takes. And we have to be willing to imagine it as having other forms than the ones that we already know and that are already a source of horror for us, rightly so. So I think there is something about the obligation to cohabit that gives us a kind of basis for an anti-genocidal politics. And this is extremely important for me. And I am indebted to Arendt for that. I also want to think about cohabitation in some other ways, and I'm not sure, she makes it into a political requirement, but she doesn't describe the phenomenologically the complexity of cohabitation itself. So it would be interesting to think about interlacing interdependency in relationship to the political requirement to cohabit. Maybe we can have a more fine-grained understanding of cohabitation that also acknowledges the strife and aggression that goes throughout cohabitation. So that's all I'll say there.
Okay, then. Bad news, good news. The bad news is that we ran out of time, and there are 9 questions put by attendees here. The good news is that we resume this seminar tomorrow. And if I understood you well, Judith, tomorrow you will leave more time for discussion,
Yes,
no?
I'm sorry. I meant to leave more time again today. Tomorrow I will have 5 propositions that I start with about gathering and not gathering, assembly, protest, and queer feminist appropriations of this tradition. You know, then we open up.
Discussion.
Okay? That's all.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So we meet tomorrow